than people that aren't these extreme adventure sport athletes. Well, the same can go for mania. If mania is sort of a flow state, can one bring some of those elements into one's daily life to be more flowy in daily life, instead of just following into the cycle of depression and then not taking anything of value from the mania? I feel like if something's taken and practiced, then maybe the depression won't happen so much. I also had a thought that it seems that there is an evolutionary force that's trying to shut down the prefrontal cortex. So mania, addictions, schizophrenia, probably various mental illnesses shut down the prefrontal cortex, which is the me, the linear thinking, the sense of separation. And then there's a lot of movement consciously to shut it down through mindfulness, through meditation, through yoga, through so many things that people are doing on a daily basis to shut it down. And in terms of the flow state that shuts it down. So flow is so great. Like, why do we need this prefrontal cortex at all? And where do we get it from? One of my questions is, why do we condition kids out of their flow? Because I feel they're in flow when they're born to a certain point, when they go to school and they learn the rules and they learn the this and they learn the judgments and they learn how to measure themselves against and compare. And then here goes the yammering voice, yada, 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 yada. Why do we give children that voice at all? And then we create all this hoopla and self-help and even this research about flow. Be like, wow, it's so amazing. Like, flow, right? Flow, we got to be in flow. Well, we were in flow when we were kids. So why do we keep giving our kids this shit? Why are we allowing them to inherit this? Why do we keep going on with this? And then interestingly enough, I don't know much about the neuroanatomy or neurophysiology or neuroelectricity or neurobiology of autism, but I'm guessing that there's something askew with the prefrontal cortex, which is the me, which is the thinking, which is the reasoning, which is the rationality, which is the judgment, which is the words, which is the language. Why are such a large percentage of children acquiring, or whatever happens? Of course, there's lots of debate about why there's so many children that are autistic or on the spectrum. They're not picking up language. I feel that language is actually the problem. We're talking about, genetics of this and genetics of that. I mentioned in another video, it's really the memes. It's the memetics. It's the words. We're poisoning each other with our words. And now there's a generation of children being born, or it's been going on for a while, and I think it'll only get worse, that are not able to pick up the language in the same way. Something that, 20 years ago was taken for granted, that a child would just pick up language. Now all of a sudden there's a whole profession and so many people trained on how to intervene to shove language down these children's throats who can't acquire it. And we never question the words themselves. We never question what it is we're trying to force them to acquire. And I feel like the prefrontal cortex is on its way out through people going through these spontaneous crises and transformations and not being steady state, and so many people meditating. There's so many people trying to get rid of the very thing that we're trying to impress upon these autistic children. And I'm not trying to say don't teach them language. It's just very sad and interesting to me that I feel autism is evolutionary as well, just like mental health and mania, and this energy coming up through people in mania. And in another video I talked about the spontaneous social behaviors that will stave off extinction. And I feel a lot of those are expressed through someone in mania with their hyper altruism and sort of dissipated out to the multitude, and then the person crashes. And instead of seeing them as sort of a hero, a temporary hero in a way, they're seen as ill. And one day that'll change. And it is different in different cultures. Like the shamanic tradition, a person is actually seen and supported to cultivate their visionary abilities and to be a healer, because they're recognized as this person is a healer. Look what they're already doing. Now let's support them to work towards integrating that so they can be that way on a daily basis. Embodied mania, hello, which is just another word. And I actually created a word. I called it shamania, because I actually feel shamanism is shamanism. I don't really know. Tomato, I don't know the right way to say it. I actually like shamanism better, but I've heard a lot of people that are shamans say shaman. So I created a little word. It's called shamania, just sort of uniting the two views of shamanism and mania. Not that they're completely congruent, but just to show parallels, that if I was to create something around embodying one's mania, I might call it shamania, even though I know nothing about shamanism. But anyways, back to the autism. My niece has autism, and she is a genius. Like, what I also feel is that it proves in a way that intelligence has nothing whatsoever to do with language and thought. She's very intelligent. She doesn't have that much language. She's getting there. She has enough to communicate with us. But she can use an iPhone and an iPad and play Nintendo and Wii like nobody's business. And she's like 3 years old when she was able to do that. I don't know what she is now, like 4? And she's so athletic. She's so energetic. She's just brilliant. And all the whatever she can do almost anything without language that we do with our language. So another part of the autism thing to me, and I empathize with it because I have a niece, but I don't empathize at the same time because there's nothing wrong with her. She's a freaking genius. And again, it just shows you don't need thought. So many there is action without thought, and this relates to J. Krishnamurti, who I may have mentioned, but I've read a lot of his stuff, and he talks about action without thought. And to me, autistic children are showing you don't need thought in terms of words for action. So many times we think we need to be thinking, okay, I gotta type on my computer in order for us to go and type on our computer. That is not true. But the trouble is that we're always yammering on that we think that the yammering actually relates to what we're doing. And then it's different if it's something like driving, where we can drive, yammer on in our heads, and then not actually know how we got home, and we think that's cool for some reason. But there is also a state where one can be driving, paying attention to what's going on, because it's actually quite beautiful and interesting out there, and not be thinking anything. And there's no thought required to drive, whether you're thinking about something else and driving through habit, or actually driving, being embodied and driving your car, which is equivalent to practicing the power of now, which Eckhart Tolle talks about. He talks about when you're washing your hands, pay attention to the sensation, be aware and present and not thinking about something else when you're washing your hands. And that's again just shutting down the me, the prefrontal cortex. That's practicing shutting that down. And in that way, I feel like we could be in more flow in daily life just by using the brain less in terms of this linear yammering thinking. And the benefit of shutting that off, they say, well, it uses less of the brain. And that's the thing. They talk about, oh, it's so interesting that we use yet less of our brain, yet we have more capacity, we're more creative when we're in that state of flow, and we're not really thinking, we're just in the moment, and if we're thinking, it's regarding to our creativity. Well, that's the thing. When we shut off this inner critic and everything, it allows, I feel, more energy to be channeled through. So I don't think of the brain necessarily as, the more patterns going on, the more it's doing. This is just noise. This is just actually interference. So the brain's a big channel and is trying to channel energy, which is the equivalent of flow. And the brain's going while it's all getting scattered, and all this creative energy is just getting, you might have a creative, energetic thing come through a little bit, but then it's like, well, yesterday this and tomorrow that and blah, blah, blah. And it's just going on and on and on. And it's actually blocking the clear channel. So I don't necessarily think I don't really agree with what they're saying, and maybe they're saying the same thing when they're saying that the brain's doing less and you can do more. This yammering on is just habit. It's just words. It's just actually interfering with the clear flow of the channel that would come through if we weren't thinking. Again, how they say we think 60,000 thoughts a day, most of them are the same as yesterday. If we weren't doing that, then something new would be coming through. We just assume we have to be doing that. But it's just a habit. And then, like Jamie Wheeler said, if he said, I don't know what he said, I lost my thought there. So there's something definitely to do with the autism thing. And again, the evolutionary movement to shut down the prefrontal cortex. And it seems that if we don't stop giving it to our children and forcing it, then children will be born where we just can't even program them to the same extent. And one day there'll be a lot of them that are adults. And they're going to have something to say. They might not have the same vocabulary, but they have a very rich experience and subjectivity. And they perceive the world in a different way. They see it with different eyes because they don't see it through all these words that we see it through. And they're going to be telling us something different. They might even revolt against us because they've already revolted against words. And what are we? We're just a bunch of words. We think we're a bunch of words because we think. So part of the embodied mania thing is transforming mental health challenges into human potential. So the human potential movement is also interesting. And I feel that mental health crisis can be used as a transformative force. It is a transformative force, and it's not being supported to be a transformative force. It's ending up in places it's not supposed to go. It could be a different world if people are seen as visionaries with potential, who see possibilities, who can be invited to share some of those in a way where they're sharing and then perhaps compensated in some way for the value that they're delivering. So I really feel like it can move towards human potential. And another term I came across recently, well, I think I already mentioned it, is morphogenetic. And I don't think that's a word that Stephen and Jamie talked about. But I wanted to, in the spirit of relanguaging, because a lot of this revisioning is actually relanguaging, especially since most people see the world through the language they use. And in a way, the visions need to be translated into language. And I'm not talking visions like, oh, woo, whatever. Just what we see, what we feel, what we experience. Right now, the language is one of pathology. And it would be interesting to create more context and more language used to describe these things, so then people can see and experience them differently and maybe choose a different paradigm. And it doesn't have to be an exclusion to mental illness or diagnosis, but there's a big importance in making meaning out of the experience, whether it's an illness or not, especially because it's an illness maybe. So the term morphogenetic, I think it could be morphomimetic. Genetic sounds like genes. I don't know if that's supposed to be genetic as in like generate. I'm not sure where that term comes from. Well, I know Rupert Sheldrake was the one to coin it. And I do like the idea of the morphogenetic field. But I feel it could also be somewhat a morphomimetic field. If there's all these memes and the memes are competing for brain space in all these different brains in human beings, there is a morphomimetic field, and it seems that there's a certain number of memes that are infecting our brains that I think are very detrimental. So I'd like to invite conversation to change and contribute to the morphomimetic field. And I think that mania is an attempt to change the morphomimetic field with the spontaneous social behaviors. And it's interesting because in mania, when I experience spontaneous social behaviors, a lot of people respond in kind, consciously or subconsciously. So it does create that little mark on their brains and their experience and their own holographic structure. It repatterns. I feel like mania is the energy of a pattern that repatterns reality through these spontaneous social behaviors. And it keeps popping up in different places, and people often act very similar in those energetic states. So that says something, that there's got to be some kind of reason or force or purpose around it. And also maybe one day with all these people popping up and then people responding in kind to a certain level, not the same energy. Eventually one day people will respond more and more, and that'll get passed on, and it will change the fabric of reality until one day people that pop up into mania are probably just normal. That's just how most people are most of the time. Happy, playful, going back to being childlike. And you think of being childlike, and then you think of the biblical references, be as a child or something. I don't know much about the Bible. Though when I'm in those altered states, I feel I know a lot about that stuff. So again, with mania and the energy coming up through the person, it's like a person gets charged like a capacitor, and then they're going around and discharging little bits as they interact with different people, and that energy gets spread out and dissipated over time. So it's like being a capacitor. Actually, now that I think about it, if a person practices some of those manic traits that they experience in those high energy states, and then they practice them in daily life, when that energy comes again, the capacitor will stay charged longer because it'll actually be embedded in the neurobiology of the person. And maybe they'll get dissipated less, and then a person will be less affected by this dissipating charge and go down slower or go down less. It won't be such an extreme and such a fast dissipation of the energy. So I feel that that could build up capacitance. And so that's another important thing. And not only that, that makes sense too. If a person's embodying their mania in daily life and the energy comes, it won't really be such a big difference because they'll already be working towards being like that state, that brain state, as brain traits. So it won't be that different. So it won't be such like an up and down. And also the energy might be able to stay, or if the energy doesn't come again like that to an extreme, as the person practices and practices and practices, it gives the chance for the energy to come in and sort of fill that practice space. So a person is able to go to a higher energy level in daily life by practicing, even though maybe that energy never comes back to a certain extreme. Though it may, but then again, it just won't feel like such an extreme because it was practiced. So it could even be that mania or those states of consciousness are inviting us to level up because, hey, this energy is coming, so we better be able to embody it, or it's going to make us nuts. Because if it is too much of a change, it is like, whoa, I was this and now I'm in the depths of despair. And that's really difficult to go from one extreme to the other, because then the other extreme feels that much worse because we were just at the high extreme. So not only does it feel like this is the worst thing ever, it feels like what just happened to how great it was just a few days ago. So it's there's a lot to that. It's really interesting. And that's why I feel like embodying mania, or you could think finding your flow, if you want to take those other terms. Maybe it's as simple as finding how one flows, instead of thinking, well, I got to practice these traits. Just instead of thinking in terms of traits, think in terms of the flow or the activities. So say I get into flow when I'm reading and writing and thinking or watching YouTube videos, do that more, and then I'm in that. I'm probably going to be practicing those traits. And part of me making these videos for myself is like practicing the traits, because part of me wants to be able to have a conversation about this stuff and instead of waiting till I find somebody to have a conversation with, just having a conversation with myself. And what I'm finding, and I guess it's true when I write sometimes too, is if I have a thought or an idea and I put it down in writing, then something else comes to me and I write it down and then build on that. It's not like I had the entire thing before I started. And I'm finding the same thing with making these videos for myself. Some of the stuff, when I start talking about it, I think of another thought, idea. It comes to me. And I'm not saying that these are like true or anything, but there are ways to think of it differently or see it differently in a way. It's not really ways to think about it differently, because I don't know, it's not really something you think about. The things I'm talking about is that you kind of see it or you don't see it. If you don't see it, it doesn't matter. And if you've never been in these extreme states, if you're a steady state person, you probably won't see it. But maybe you will. I shouldn't say shouldn't either. Oh, words are getting the best of me right now. So I feel like perhaps one day, maybe when a person is able to practice embodying mania to a certain extent and kind of be in that zone, that it'll be a self-fulfilling state where one is just in sort of a flow state that's not as extreme as the high ecstasy of mania for the most part, but is like very much grounded and in the state of love and joy and all those grounded, balanced states of being. I guess maybe some of it is just creating a balanced state between being active and having those spontaneous social behaviors, and maybe part of it is just to pass along some of those spontaneous social behaviors, and it doesn't require that everybody go into mania. And that's one of my things too, is by practicing the traits, maybe they'll be mirrored by other people. So manic traits could be passed on to other people through gestures. So we think of so much of sharing information, of like thinking and words and thoughts. But information is also action and gesture. And I was doing some research on that, and how something like a kind act, if somebody sees it, they'll be way more likely to be kind to someone else in the next 2 hours. I don't know, 2 to 4 hours or something. So that's what I mean by gestures. So manic traits, say I was super generous and kind and friendly. Well, maybe I can't be like that to the same extreme every moment of every day. But I could be that 2% more. And then from that 2% more, build on to 2% more and 2% more, until maybe I'm 50% like that. And being 50% more like that in daily reality passes on in gestures and in things people see throughout the day that change their behavior, that isn't about, hey, you need to change this. And I guess that's part of the self-help, is you should do this and you should do that and you should change this, which is a bunch of words telling you what to do. Well, you got to put in your prefrontal cortex and practice and blah blah blah. So I think that's the great thing about the mania, is that a person, it's not words, it's I was this embodied for a short period of time in mania. Now, how can I practice that in movement, in action, in gesture, in the things that I say on a daily basis, to again operate at that 11 that Jamie Wheel said, operate at 11 and see what's present, versus using the level of thought, the self-help. So the daily action, again, goes with embodying one's mania. So harvesting the mania and the traits to embody it in daily life, and say being 50% manic, but not in the state, not unbalanced, but manic in terms of the traits and the way one was. And that's usually what feels the best anyway, is how nice it was to be the way that we were in that state. It feels great in the state, but if we can be that way that we were, we're probably going to feel pretty darn good on a daily basis. So moving towards that, and then, yeah, I'm seeing that changing through just daily action. And I did research like random acts of kindness and things, and people in mania are very randomly kind. And these are the spontaneous social behaviors that Buckminster Fuller, I feel, was talking about, and the things that need to be solved beyond the level of thought, and thought is the level that created problems. Seeing beyond problems and seeing that life's not all about problems. When we're in mania, life's not about problems. It's about being playful, being loving, being caring. And I'm generalizing here. Yes, some people in those states get rather angry. And in my feeling, it's oftentimes due to injustice, and not necessarily personal injustice, but things that are just not okay. And I think I've talked about that a bit before. So that's also why I'm making videos. I just wanted to translate some of what I've thought and explored or pondered into video. And like I said, we're sort of visionaries. We can sort of see things, we can see feelings, we can see patterns, and we can see like images, or we can see how certain things extrapolate back into the past and maybe where it came from and was created, and we can see extrapolations into the future. So in that way we can kind of foresee the future. Doesn't mean that's the way it's going to happen, but we can kind of see the pattern beyond the actual thing that's happening now, and extrapolate it and associate it, and we can see, like, it can be scary sometimes. So it's not really like anything too unbelievable that people can sense these things. It's pattern recognition. And I feel, well, they talked about in the flow state how we can recognize patterns more, and that's part of being in flow. It again goes with mania and altered states of consciousness. We can recognize patterns, and in that way we see patterns, we see visions, or we see images, and then we sense what that means, and then that whole meaning gets translated from that image and from that feeling and from that impression into sound, into words. And the words that come from that come from the pattern recognition, they have a different intensity. They have a different weight than the recombined associations from one's personal memory banks, which are just mainly conditioning. They don't have a very large value. So there's a difference between thought that's going on in the prefrontal cortex and repetitive, and the thought that comes from insight, which is the seeing of the pattern, of the whole, of whatever it is that one is seeing. And that's part of the flow state too. And that's how a person can have sort of like real intuition and felt senses of things. It's just sort of the brain calculating beyond the linear thought pattern, which is just very linear, logical reason. We think that that is where it's at, but it's really where it was. It's old. It's not seeing anything new. And that's why people can really read body language and really read into things when they have altered states of consciousness, is because they can read the patterns of the body and the facial expression and everything and one's energy. And that's why a lot of people that are in these mental health crises don't respond well to so many of the people that are employed to help, because those helpers, many of them aren't there for the right reasons. Many of them are. And then there's lots that are there with good intentions in their heart, but their energy is not in the right place, or the way they're approaching people or receiving people that need help. People really need to be listened to, but there's not really time for that. So that's why diagnosis is a convenient way to not listen to people. It's like writing them off. So yeah, mania could be some kind of high performance. And it's like stepping into the high performance vehicle version of yourself. Like yesterday, I was a Toyota Corolla, and now I am a I don't know, I'm trying to think of a high performance car.